Seniors first. Take, go ahead now.
And push the button.
The question is actually about the thesis that we heard yesterday, that the Bible is, or the story of the Bible being discussed here, is a propaganda work to prove the importance and the centralism of Jerusalem and the justice of the monotheistic religion in the times of Yoshiao, and the victory over all the other religions that were the religions of the Jewish people, because the Jewish people were not monotheistic, they were polytheistic up to the exile. Now my question is, how is it possible to treat such a diverse ontology of texts, including so many contradictions, including a diversity and a contradiction of opinions, some of them in the line of this propaganda, some of them against it. For instance, Yerovam ben Nevat, the man who created the state of the kingdom of Israel by dividing the kingdom, by taking away 10 tribes from the 12 tribes, by making Yehuda a very small kingdom. Of course, he's portrayed by many as a sinner, as somebody who committed terrible crimes against the nation, etc. But there is also a text in the same anthology, and not far away from the text that are accusing him, that says that he was nominated by a prophet of Yahweh to do this thing because of the terrible sins of Solomon, who is supposed to be an ideal king, but this is a man who built temples to all the foreign gods, only one temple to Yahweh, but many temples to all other foreign gods. And as because of this sin, the prophet says to Yerovam, you have to tear away the kingdom from Beit David. Now, I'm not saying that one or the other is the main line of the Bible. I'm only saying that the diversity of the text is such that we cannot conclude from the thesis, from the premise that all this is a propaganda, we cannot conclude from this about the facts or the non-facts that are mentioned there. And finally, even the golden calf, which is the main sin of the Jews according to the writers who identify with Moses. But when Yerovam ben Nevat opens the new temple in Bethel and in Dan, and he repeats the words of the first great priest of Israel, Aaron, the brother of Moshe, who says, this, the golden calf, is the God that took you out of Egypt. And Yerovam says exactly the same thing. And of course, many of the editors were against Yerovam and against the golden calf and were accusing them. But I think this is one of the greatness of these editors, that they were liberal enough to write their editorials, but to bring all the other facts that are contradicting their editorials. And therefore we should look at the Bible not, or various stories in the Bible, not only as an ideological document, but as a part of the first ontology in the history of literature, which includes works of literature. Like all works of literature, they are representing a reality, not a reality of events, but a reality of a social reality, spiritual reality, etc. And the spiritual reality that they represent is a diversity, a pluralism, a contradiction like we have today.
Israel, you want to respond to that?
First we'll get the other.
What? Well, why don't you respond to that quickly? Let's respond.
No, I basically agree. How do I? Can you hear me? I'll do this.
You have to push the button.
I don't see a button.
The green light needs
It's not green.
Okay, fine. Thanks. No, don't do this. Well, I basically agree with Yaakov. I just would like to say in one sentence or two, one. First of all, we are dealing with a very long compilation process, which started, in my opinion, in the 8th century and ended probably in the 2nd century BC, if we take the prophetic works, like the book of Daniel, for instance. So such a long process should be studied on the background of the changing times. Secondly, we are dealing with different populations, and the importance and beauty of the text is that it tries to achieve some sort of harmony among the Israelites, even in late monarchic times, and indeed includes traditions of the north in a text which basically serves the aims and goals of the south. So we need to see this on this background. And finally, many of the stories, such as, in my opinion, the story that you mentioned of Jeroboam the first and the calf, should be seen as some sort of polemics, pros and cons, and basically depicting the ideology of the time. So it is an ideological compilation, but it tries, and this we spoke yesterday, the two of us, about the difference between the Soviets and the authors of the Bible. Simply, the authors of the Bible were more clever.
Anyhow, the editors were.
Yeah.
Paula?
I'm trying to. I don't really have a response to that.
Brian?
Yeah, sure. Several
Well,
things. Let me.
microphone
Yeah.
to you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Well, first, perhaps it would be helpful to you. It'll be helpful to me to just review the two major models that our speakers are either using, employing, or supposing as they approach the biblical text. Mind if I do that quickly? Just review the two and summarize. Would that be helpful? As I understand our speakers correctly, Professor Mazar begins with the more traditional scholarly model of how the Bible was composed, the Hebrew Bible. That we have a first stage with two major sources brought together that comprise what we call the Tetratuch, the 4 books of Moses. Okay? Genesis through Numbers. And then there's a question among scholars whether Deuteronomy goes with this earlier material, stage 1, or if Deuteronomy actually begins what we traditionally call the Deuteronomistic history. Okay? So just understand that you will hear from scholar to scholar differing views on Deuteronomy's role. Okay? The book of Deuteronomy. But we typically refer to this as either the Tetratuch or, among some scholars, the Pentateuch. Stage 1. And in the traditional scholarly model, that production took place in the days of Solomon, as some scholars refer to the Solomonic Enlightenment, this time of flourishing of literary production. Okay? Stage 2, the Deuteronomistic history, sometime in the divided monarchy, 8th or 7th century, for some scholars a little later. But it's definitely coming from a southern perspective, and it spans everything from the conquest to the destruction of Jerusalem, and what some scholars have referred to as the national history proper. It is national in scope. Remember, if you look back at the Pentateuch or the Tetratuch, the 4 books, these are stories about individual ancestors, families, and clans, not about a nation yet. Okay? So that's stage 2 in the traditional model. Stage 3 is a literary activity that involves the bringing together of these 2 large blocks of material, and also the insertion of or inclusion of what we call priestly material, the priestly writer that our 2 speakers have referred to. And typically, and again, these are often matters of majority vote, most scholars see this as a production in the exilic or post-exilic period by a group or an individual with explicitly priestly concerns. But this is a profound stage of the process, because it's this individual we traditionally see as bringing together the Tetrarch or Pentateuch and the Deuteronomistic history, adding major portions to that block of material, like major sections of Leviticus, priestly material. Okay? So that's the three-stage process of the traditional modern scholarly framework. Now, as I understand Professor Finkelstein, he agrees with stages 2 and 3, Deuteronomistic history in the late monarchic period, the priestly editing of that product, as well as the addition of other materials. But where Professor Finkelstein differs significantly from the traditional modern scholarly model is that he sees the Tetrarch, or the Pentateuch, as actually being produced at some time either contemporary with the Deuteronomistic history or possibly later. And it functions for this priestly writer that brings them together as a prologue to the national history. Okay? You follow so far? And that has significant ramifications at some levels, but at other levels, there aren't great differences. I want to highlight some of these and see if I can draw these out for our speakers and for you as well through the remainder of the weekend, so you can kind of have your antenna up as the speakers discuss these matters. They do become significant. So that's the major difference. And this newer model, where we see the Pentateuch is actually either contemporary with or slightly later than the Deuteronomistic history, means that it's coming from the late monarchic period, and it has a southern orientation, although it's incorporating northern materials as well. Or as Professor Finkelstein explained, that this reflects a time when there was a great interest in the South with regard to the North, whatever those interests were. But they're there and they're included in the materials. And this raises the question for me, and a nagging question for scholars in our field, and that is this: how did the biblical writers write what they wrote? And we're interested here, and I have in mind here both method, actually the process, and their motivations. Okay? And that's really where we want to go with this in terms of this weekend, because the question we're asking is, are these materials here something we can do historical research on, right? Everyone recognizes these are great literary productions. And as Rabbi Malkin pointed out, this almost of a anthology of materials. But the real question of this colloquium is, can we investigate these materials for historical information? And from that, can we reconstruct anything? I'll put it that way. Okay? So let me go to the heart of my point here now. Both scholars, both speakers, refer to propaganda and ideology on the one hand. They both recognize that to a great degree our authors, whenever and whomever they are influenced by contemporary events in their own time and their own motivations. But at the same time, they both recognize that there are older traditions in those productions. Okay? So they see this as somehow related to investigation of the past. I'm leaving that purposely vague for a moment. And as I understand both our speakers, here's where they differ. And Professor Mazar really pointed this out in his last or most recent lecture, and almost stole away my response in the process. And that's this. While they both recognize that there are these older traditions, whether they're folkloristic materials, mythological materials, legendary materials, historical data, all of the above, the question is, can we, from the modern perspective, historians today, can we access that material? Can we get to it? Can we identify it? And if we can, how much of it can we identify? And then from there, can we move to the next stage of, if you will, the reconstructive process, reconstructing a history behind the text. And what we're really looking for here, to keep in mind as historians, is we're really interested in reconstructing Israelite society in the Iron Age, behind the text, not in the text. And both of our authors recognize that really we're looking for something we call inferred from the text at times. So if I understand our speakers correctly, we recognize that there are these older materials, and apparently the question is, for us as modern historians, can we access that material? Okay? So keep that in mind as you listen to our speakers. Secondly, there's also this, it keeps coming back into the discussion, and that is this. When these biblical writers wrote, how did they understand what they were doing? It's one thing for us to say, oh, well, we stumbled across this historical datum in this text by coincidence. You know, there's a mention of an Assyrian king in the biblical text, and we found this Assyrian king archaeologically documented in Mesopotamia. Well, was that coincidence? Did our author, the biblical author we might have in mind in 2 Kings, did he know about this king? And what did he know, and how much did he know? Is it indirect or direct knowledge, or secondhand knowledge? Or is it inferential? Passing on the traditions. If you could have crossed him on the street corner and said, hey, wait a minute, you know, I was reading your book the other day, and you mentioned this guy Sennacherib. Who? Or he may say, oh yeah, absolutely, I did all the research on this guy. Now you see, that has serious implications for how we read the biblical text today. Not just academic historians, but how you read the text. And those are the kind of questions we want to try to raise here, so you have your antenna up throughout the colloquium, listening to both our speakers and the respondents, asking those questions. How did the biblical writers go about writing the biblical text? And secondly, what can we access historically in terms of data? Okay? So my question, and by the way, this all does lead to somewhere. So the question for my two speakers, either they can address it now or in the process of their lectures, make it more explicit for all of us, is how do you, Professor Mazar, and how do you, Professor Finkelstein, view this process of writing by the biblical writers? What did they do, both in terms of method and motivation, and what can we access? Okay? Thank you.
Professor McNutt and I are at a loss after that. I will bet you Yaakov and Felice Malkin's round-trip airfare that I'm the only person in this room who can say that he is a priest. And I know about priestly concerns, and I know that my type will always try to manipulate text to serve priestly concerns. So I just want to have that out on the table first. I have always been fascinated with the phenomenon of memory and of how important it is to the work that each of us does in our own way. My dissertation committee brought back from retirement an Old Testament scholar named Otto Bob a long time ago, who insisted in many of his writings and to me that memory in dealing with text, he was a textual scholar, not an archaeologist, but that memory is an essential thing to keep in mind and how it works. Every couple of years, my family and I go to Italy, where my wife's family lives. 10 or 12 Italians food fights. Be interested in your woven somehow into the text. And
but I have an important question having to deal with our advertising.
Moses, do you remember? All right. Now, the most important figure in traditional Judaism, and in fact, saying there is no Jesus do you understand, was addressed by the two of you to, you talk about the Exodus, ultimately in the text that was created, of this gigantic, enormous figure called Moses. I mean, go tell Michelangelo. You know. So, I mean, it's his role is entirely and totally depicted in the Torah text, or are you saying there may have been a Moses, but we know absolutely nothing about him? Could you just address that very briefly, because after our advertising is at stake.
Sales will be up after this session.
Either Israel,
Ami, you want to be first or me? Okay. You chicken out, huh? Well, know nothing about Moses. However, we cannot say archaeology does not deal with individuals. Archaeology cannot shed light. There could have been an important figure, a leader, a prophet, a writer, well, maybe not a writer, but a significant person in the very early formative history of those. But this figure is simply beyond recovery archaeologically and also historically. So we have to find a way between, there could have been. We can even, I think, I will try to be even more courageous here, to say that we basically know nothing about Exodus. And we cannot read Exodus in a simplistic way on the background of Egypt of the 13th century BC. However, we cannot say that there was no Exodus whatsoever, some sort of a movement of people between Egypt, the reality on the border between Canaan and Egypt in antiquity. I mentioned in brief in my presentation, came up with a very brilliant idea, and who suggested that the events far back in the 16th century BC could have been the background behind this memory that was kept by the people of Canaan throughout the generations of a major deportation of people of Canaanite, Asiati, call them as you wish, from the Delta in antiquity. And that this memory was later reshaped more than once, became, by the way, more important, apparently, in the memory of the northern people of Israel than of the south, and finally found its way into the text in the way we read it.
Let me just
Amichai?
one addition to what Finkelstein said.
About Moses?
Yes.
Good, it's about Moses.
Well,
I'm wondering.
a few months ago, I asked various audiences in Europe who is the most important historical personality in your country in our time. The Germans said Adenauer. The British said Churchill. The Czechs said Yara Zimmerman. Who is Yara Zimmerman? Well, Yara Zimmerman is the hero of a very successful play that goes in Prague from the beginning of the 60s till today. So the BBC director said, yes, but he is a fictional character. So the Czech director answered, do you know any historical character that didn't become a fictional character?
Yes.
Is it time to break now? Is that?
Yeah, we're going to break. But,
okay. I didn't mean to indicate that I wasn't interested. I wasn't ready. But so I had several questions, but I want to just maybe raise one right now, and I can talk about it a bit more later. But one of the things, Brian talked a lot about the intentionality of the writers and the. Brian talked a lot about the intentionality of the writers and the writing process. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is the interpreters, the actual interpreters, and the reasons that they think the way that they think. I'll talk about it a bit more later, but what kind of question brought you to this later dating of the materials? And just in some ways, I know in my own research, there are certain things like you read